Okay, now we're going to start some of the different processes. To me, one of the easiest processes to talk about is digestion, and then followed with excretion. Now, let me start out with something that's a little... What do you think is excretion? What? Pooping, taking a poop. No! When you ingest food and you digest all of that, what's left you egest. You poop out. Now we call it excretion. There's some dog excrement over there. Yeah, I understand that. Technically, what we as biologists consider to be excretion is a physiological process of the waste materials after metabolism that are left over. So actually, the urea that comes in your urine is true excretion. So one of them is egestion, one of them is excretion. So, and I know that it sounds like we entomologists and biologists are playing tricks with words and so forth, but there are reasons why we make these distinctions. So I guess my next question then, what is digestion? Why do you eat food? To get energy, absolutely. And indeed, you need energy for you need the carbohydrates, you need the fats and things to deliver energy. But can you live alone on sugar? No. What else do you need? Even vegetarians will say you need to eat this mix of different beans and other things to provide you with the proteins and the amino acids that you need, because you need amino acids. You now know why you need amino acids in your diet. Why? We learned that in lab this week. DNA makes RNA, which makes proteins. And what are proteins made of? Amino acids. So hopefully, I hope you're kind of getting the big picture here of things that are going on. So in digestion, what it really means is that it is the food, the material that we that we take into our bodies. The food usually isn't immediately available for us, so we have to break it down. So this morning I had a banana for breakfast. So what was the first thing that I did with my banana when I stuck it in my mouth? I chewed it up. Now today I know a bunch of people, they just throw all their fruits and vegetables in a blender and they get it all blended up. And okay, so you're using a blender to mechanically break it apart. But once it gets into my stomach, I'm going to play chemical warfare with these molecules. And in our stomach, what's the first thing that our stomach bathes our food in? Acid, absolutely. And it's a strong acid. For those of you that are a little bit older that have acid reflux, what that's referring to is that the little valve that is supposed to keep all that acid in your stomach begins to fail a little bit, and so you can get some acid coming back up into your esophagus, and boy, it's nasty, and it starts to burn. Of course, we call it heartburn and all the rest of that. No, it's esophageal burn is what it is. It just happens to be around in the area where your heart is, and so we have to basically mechanically break the things down. And the reason why we're mechanically breaking this food down is to provide more surface area for the chemicals to break it down into smaller and smaller and smaller components. And eventually, with that chemistry, and we'll talk about there's other chemistry involved, things like enzymes. These are special molecules that can break some tough to break bonds in your food so that you can end up with basically the things that you need to be able to absorb. And that's simple sugars and amino acids. That's where you really need to break your material down to so that you can then take that in. Once you get it into your body, what are you going to do with the sugars? That's going to be your energy. And what are you going to do with amino acids? That's what you're going to build things with. Biologists break digestion down to these four processes. First, we have to take it in, so that's the ingestion. Then we have to break it down, both mechanically and chemically, eventually down to molecules, down to the molecular level. That's the digestion. Then we have to take that into our body. That's the absorption. And then anything that wasn't digested, anything that's left over, we egest. So that comes down to that defecation is really egestion. Now, what are our food groups? And again, I'm totally amazed at the lack of education that our general populace has on this. To me, this is something that everybody should know coming out of high school. Hell, you should even know this coming out of grade school. But for some reason, when I start asking I've got a granddaughter that's in junior high now, and when I start talking about some of these terms, it's like I'm speaking Greek to her. And I'm just amazed. But to me, this is really essential stuff for life. This is stuff you need to know. So we bring in carbohydrates. What are carbohydrates? Sugars and starches. Why do you need carbohydrates? Well, these are the things that when they're in your cells, when you use these in the cells, and generally about the only ones that we can really use are things like glucose. That's the sugar that we have. And it's kind of interesting. What kind of sugar does a plant have? Sucrose. But I told you have to have glucose to use as energy. So what does that mean that you have to do to a plant sugar before you can actually use it? Yeah, or convert it. In this case, you're going to convert that sucrose into glucose, and then your cells can use it. So there's an additional little step in the digestive process, a little chemical trickery that has to go on. Now, what is starch? Starch is really nothing more than a polymer of sugars. It's a whole bunch of sugar molecules all joined together. What does that mean? It means that it's a way to pack a lot of energy into a single molecule. But it takes a fair amount of energy to break that starch molecule back apart, convert it back into the sugars, because it's really only the sugar that you can use for that. We'll talk about that later on. We have another storage material, lipids. Now, lipids, again, can be broken down and eventually turned in, at least a component of the lipids can be turned into carbohydrates. But you need lipids. Why in the world do you need lipids? Well, I'm going to tell you that your cell membrane is a lipoprotein matrix. What does that mean? Well, that means every one of your cells in your body, in order to contain all of the hardware that's in the inside of that cell, has a cell membrane that's made of this matrix of a lipid, that's a fat, and a protein hooked together to allow all that stuff to go on. And the beauty of this lipoprotein membrane is that things can pass through it, and I can selectively pass through things in this membrane. So a lot of people say, I'm on a fat-free diet. Don't do it unless you work with a doctor about it. Because if you completely eliminate all lipids from your diet, you can be in a world of hurt, because you need some fats and oils in your diet. Now, of course, there are some fats and oils that are better than others for us, because they're easier to metabolize, easier for us to use, and so forth. Where do you get proteins? Where do most humans get proteins? Meat. Where can you get proteins? You can get them from vegetables too. There are vegetables. But the problem with eating vegetable protein is that plants, when they make proteins and use proteins, often miss certain essential amino acids. They don't use the same complement of amino acids in their proteins that we do, or animals do. And so when you eat plant proteins, you often have to eat a variety of them so that you can get all the essential amino acids that you need to make your proteins. And so, I'm a real fan of vegetarian diets and so forth. I can't do it. I grew up in Oklahoma. I have to have my steak every Friday night. But I admire people that really look into this and figure out the right mix of the plant-based proteins that give them all the essential amino acids that they need. Now, I have another thing in here called vitamins. Vitamins are kind of an interesting group of chemicals. Basically, what vitamins are chemicals that synergize activity. Another word for them would be they're a catalyst. And what they do is they have to be available for certain physiological processes to undergo. Do you think an insect needs vitamins? Absolutely. That's often a mistake. Kids, remember when we went all the way back and we had those mealworm culture in the laboratory, and I said, notice that it looks like somebody threw a piece of banana peel in here or a piece of orange rind and so forth. The reason why that was put in there is that provides vitamins into that system so that those beetles can complete their metabolism because they need those vitamins. Now, here's the bad part about vitamins. Most of the vitamins you can make in your body from the food components. But there are some vitamins you can't make. You have to get them from your food. And so that can be a really interesting one. How about vitamin C? Can you make vitamin C? What is vitamin C? What's a lack of vitamin C cause? Scurvy. So sailors that didn't have citrus in their diet started getting gum diseases. The tissues would begin to rot and decay and slough away because you can't make vitamin C. You have to get it. That's why we recommend everybody should have a glass of orange juice every morning to get that vitamin C. We also have inorganic materials that you need. What would you be without calcium? A blob. You need the mineral calcium. Well, you actually need the mineral calcium for many things, but primarily for your bones, your teeth, things like that. It provides the structural elements in there that make the bones and teeth what they are. So you need those. But you need other minerals. You need a little zinc in your diet. You need some iron in your diet. Why do you need iron in your diet? That's the essential molecule in hemoglobin that helps hemoglobin attach onto oxygen. So you need to chew on a nail once in a while. No, you don't need to do that. But, if you are a vegetarian, then you do need something that will get that iron into your diet. Normally, meat eaters, people that eat meat, get the blood that's in that meat into their diet, and so you get the iron that way. Oh, and we all need water. Why do we all need water? Water is the molecule that all of this floats around in and works in. Oh boy. All right. Now we're going to talk about the chemical process of digestion. We haven't really talked that much about the physical process. We'll cover some of that when we talk about some of these digestive systems that we'll serve or take a look at. But we do need to realize that digestion is primarily, in its final stages, a chemical process. And it's a chemical process of breaking things down. And let's take a look at this. Now, for us, what did I tell you you needed glucose for? Well, that's the sugar that you use for energy inside each one of your cells. How do you get that glucose? Well, if you eat a lot of bread or starch, and by the way, for those people that have children, it's a common known fact that children like a piece of bread. When you give them a piece of bread, they'll chew on it, they'll chew on it, they'll chew on it, And you go, why'd you swallow that? Why do they keep chewing on it for a while? Well, there is actually amylase in your saliva. That amylase, if you chew on that bread long enough, will break the bread down to glucose and it will become sweet. So all the kid is doing is getting a little sugar fix out of that piece of bread. If you chew it long enough, it will become sweet. Now, the rest of us, we just wolf them down because we're on the go. We want to get to the next piece of food or whatever and so forth. But if you chew on it long enough and you got spit, meaning water, you'll convert that starch that's in the bread into sugar and it will taste sweet to you. Now, do you notice on all of these, when I convert fats, when I convert proteins, and so forth, what is the one thing that is always being added to these molecules? Water. So that's what that H2O, the NH2O means a number of molecules of water. Depending on the starch, each starch may require a different number of water molecules to be added to it to break it down. Also notice amylase, lipase, proteinase, polypeptidase, dipeptase. Do you get what I'm getting at? Anything that ends in an ACE, that ASA or ASE, what we're saying is that it's an enzyme that breaks that thing apart. So amylin is the Greek word for starch. So amylase means it is a molecule that breaks starches. Lipids is the other name for fats. So a lipase is something that breaks fats down. Proteinase is an enzyme that breaks proteins apart. Got it? So again, all of these are pretty simple. What we do is we add water in the presence of these enzymes, and we can break these things down into smaller and smaller fragments. Now, did you notice that proteins is really complicated? Because I can have various proteinases that help me break proteins down, but proteins are really long chains of amino acids. And so even though I break it down into protein fragments, what it usually has to do is now I have to add other additional enzymes in there to break it down finally to my amino acids. And basically what I do is I've got, now what does polypeptide mean? That means that there's multiple amino acids still hooked together. And what that does is break them down so that I get dipeptides. So that now means only 2 amino acids hooked together. And so if I use a dipeptidase, I can finally break those final 2 amino acids apart, and now I'll just have the individual amino acids. Complicated process. Requires lots of energy to do this. That's why when you eat a really heavy protein meal, you want to go to sleep. Your body needs to work on that. It takes a while to work that over and get it broken down into the amino acids. Any questions over this? Yeah.
Will you need to memorize any of these combinations?
I think if you look on the second exams, the answer is yes. Yes.
The X before the H2O mean?
That means for depending on the number of amino acids that are in that polypeptide, changes the number of water molecules that comes off of it. And so the X is like the N's and the M's. The only one that's consistent is that every fat is actually 3 fatty acids hooked together. So I only need 3 water molecules to break that apart. Yes?
So is that why your mouth waters when you think about food you want?
Actually, the reason why your mouth waters is that, number one, your sensory organs in your nose has smelled the food, and so in essence you're right. It's not only water that's coming out of there, but you have a lot of amylase in your saliva, and there's some other, there's actually sometimes some proteinases that are in there that basically what's happened is that your nasal passages have told the brain, I smell food, it's coming, get ready. And it's partly to add water. You add more water in your stomach. There are glands in your water that add more to it. But the other thing, have you ever felt saliva? Spit sometimes. Take it in your finger. Oh, come on now. Is it dry? It's slick. So what else do you have in your saliva? You have mucus. And the reason why you have mucus is you need mucus to allow that food to slide down your esophagus. So saliva is kind of a complicated thing. Yes, there's water in it, there's digestive enzymes in there, and there's mucopolysaccharides, mucus. Okay, theoretically, you saw the digestive tract of a cockroach in the laboratory this last week. I'm not sure how many of them really took a look at it. But I've actually taken a drawing of a cockroach gut and pulled it out. Remember that all insects have 3 parts to their digestive tract. And we try to really make this tough for you. They have a foregut, midgut, and hindgut. Is that simple enough? Got it? The foregut is lined with exoskeleton. So what does that mean? When the insect molts, it actually has to remove the lining of the foregut. Exoskeleton is impermeable to water. So in this cockroach, what I have here, the technical first part of the foregut runs from the esophagus here to the crop, includes the proventriculus, but right here where the proventriculus joins on to what you might call the intestines, that's the junction that turns into the midgut. So, how much absorption? If I've got a cockroach that ate, let's say, a sugar cube, so its crop is full of sugar, how much can it absorb? Nothing. It can't absorb anything in that foregut because there's this cuticular lining in there. Wow, that's kind of odd. So in the insect, now I can add digestive enzymes from the salivary glands of the cockroach. There could be the salivary glands, some amylase, proteinases, things like that was mixed in that food. So that food can start the digestion process, both chemically, from the chemicals that are in there, and mechanically the insect chewed it up, made it into smaller particles. But I find it kind of interesting, in the insect, it's going to chew it again. So right here at this proventriculus, now in older books they call that the gizzard of the insect. Now I don't like the term because gizzard to me is something that's in a bird. What is the gizzard of a bird? Anybody rear birds?
Isn't that red thing?
Yeah, it's that red thing right in the gut. And my wife loves fried gizzards, and because they're nothing but a packet of muscle. And what are they? If you ever rear birds, you have to provide birds grit. This is really important. We get a lot of people that say they want to raise chickens here in the urban habitat. I got nothing against that. I think that's great and wonderful to have some local food and eggs, the rest of that. But they forget you need to put out a little pan of crushed shell or some coarse sand over there. Why? Because that bird's going to go pick that up. Those pebbles are going to go down to the gizzard, and when the muscles of the gizzard with those rocks are in there, help grind up the food. Now in the insect, that proventriculus actually has teeth on the inside of it that are made of exoskeleton. And when that proventriculus muscle contracts, those teeth grind the food again further. So insects have the initial mechanical grinding of the food in the mouth with the mandibles, but then they have a secondary grinding, like a gizzard of a bird, in that proventriculus. Neat. What that means is that now in the midgut, and this is where it gets really bizarre, the midgut of an insect is really only one cell layer thick. Now they're thick columnar cells, but what does that mean? If your gut was one cell layer thick, what would be the worst thing that would normally happen to you? Get a hole poked in your gut. What happens when you get a hole poked in your gut? Stuff starts leaking out into your body cavity. Septicemia is the term that we use for that. You get a septic abdomen. If your appendix burst, that's basically all of your waste material is being blown out into your abdomen. Septicemia is caused by that. Well, what insects do is they actually have a lining that they produce right there at the junction of the proventriculus and the beginning of the midgut, and we call this the peritrophic membrane. We'll talk about it in greater detail here again in a minute. But this membrane basically acts as a porous sausage casing to keep the food bolus from rubbing on the cells in that midgut. Because if those midgut cells get rubbed on and broken apart, the insect is in real trouble. So it's got this little sort of sausage casing in there. Now the sausage casing is permeable. It really, under a high power microscope, looks like a hairnet. So it keeps the food particles together, but allows chemicals to go in and out, so that you can put digestive enzymes in there and you can get the digested molecules back out. So in essence, the midgut is primarily the place, other than the salivary glands, where digestive enzymes are secreted into the lumen to digest the food, and it's where digested food has to be absorbed. That's really different than us. We break down our chemical digestion and absorption in different locations in our gut, but when it comes to the insect, if you think about it, the foregut is really a holding area to hold freshly taken in food. The midgut is where both digestion and absorption occurs. So what's in the hindgut? Well, the hindgut is, again, lined with cuticulin. However, in the rectum, right back here, there are little gaps in that cuticular lining. And that means that there are some cells that can come into contact with the food bolus and take all the water out of it. This is why most insects produce a dry fecal pellet. Being small means that you lose water easily. So you want to keep as much water as you can. So any of the undigested waste goes into the hindgut. Most of the water is sucked out of it there, and then a dry fecal pellet is produced and egested. Now, this digestive pattern, foregut, midgut, and hindgut, can take a whole bunch of different forms. Probably the simplest one over there is the springtail. You can just see it's a simple tube in the foregut. It's kind of a long digestive and absorptive tube in the midgut, and then a small hindgut for egestion of the material. I think the caterpillar is even funnier. It's got a really short foregut, a really long midgut. And basically all the caterpillar tries to do is says, I'm not even going to spend a bunch of time trying to chew the leaves up. When I chewed them up the first time in my mouth and swallowed them, all I'm going to try to do is just absorb all the nutrients I can from that original chewing up of those leaf tissues, and then I'm going to poop out everything else. And if you've ever reared caterpillars, it's a pain in the rear end, because you feed them and feed them and feed them, and they poop and poop and poop and poop. And it just seems like an endless process until finally they pupate and you're done. Yes? Now remember that we're talking about egestion is the elimination of the undigested food material. Excretion is the nitrogenous waste material. And that's usually done by more of a glandular situation. And I'm glad you brought that up. Let me see if I can go back up here. Now you'll notice that the yellow here is the foregut, this tan is the midgut, and the green here is the hindgut. But what I didn't talk about were all these little tubules here. Those little tubules are the Malpighian tubules. And it's the Malpighian tubules that basically they're floating in the hemolymph of the insect. And what they're doing is they're picking up the nitrogenous waste. Now we'll talk about what we mean by nitrogenous waste a little bit later. They then convert that nitrogenous waste to uric acid, which is then eliminated into the hindgut, which is then egested out. Yeah, that's enough on that. Let's take a look. To me, does this look familiar to you? Anybody seen that before? Hope you have. However, let's take a look at this now in the aspect of the insect. So we've already talked about, let's say I've got a piece of bread, I've put it in my mouth and I've chewed it up, and what did I add to it? Some saliva. And slime. Okay. And so, in essence, I'm starting the digestive process, but then I get it down to my stomach. And all I need is a simple tube, my esophagus, to get it down there. Now, once it gets in the stomach, I stick a whole bunch of hydrochloric acid in there. Strong stuff. And if you've ever thrown up after a party, that stings and burns, especially gets up in your nasal passages. I know it's never happened to the bug doc, but I've heard that's what happens. And get that really yucky, bitter taste and so forth after it's all over with and so forth. But why? You're bathing everything in acid. What's interesting is in the insect, most of their digestion is in an alkaline process, not an acidic process. So it's very different. Now, once you've bathed this food that you've chewed up and you've churned it around in an acid bath, then you need to pour it on down into your intestines where the nutrients can start to be absorbed. But what's all that acid going to do to your small intestines? It could burn a hole into it. So how do I fix that? Well, your liver helps out. Your liver produces a material called bile fluid that's kept in your gallbladder. That bile fluid is a highly alkaline material, and it's dumped right here where the stomach empties out. Your pancreas also produces deacidifying materials, and it dumps it in there. So basically, when the acidic food comes out of the stomach, as soon as it comes out, bile is added to it, pancreatic fluid is added to it, and now it becomes a neutral to slightly alkaline material. Now it's not going to harm the cells in your gut, and now you can absorb the nutrients that are in there. So now you know what your pancreas does. Okay? It helps deacidify your foods. Can you live without your pancreas? Yeah, absolutely you can. However, what does that mean? You're probably going to have to take deacidifying tablets to help you out with that. Now, the other thing that we didn't mention is also in your pancreas are some special cells that are called the isles of Langerhans. They produce insulin. And so if your pancreas is removed, you're automatically a diabetic. And so you're going to have to take insulin on a regular basis to do that. Found it interesting, just in the last year, there's been some new medicines that you can now take that will stimulate tired isles of Langerhans cells. What am I talking about? Remember, there's type A or type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. What is type 1 diabetes? That means genetically you can't handle the sugars. You can't make any insulin. Type 2 diabetes means is that your pancreas can produce insulin, but it doesn't produce it very effectively or very efficiently. And so you need a booster with that. And you can either take insulin shots or you can add to it. Okay, I see that it's about that time. Let's go ahead and we'll pick this up next Tuesday and finish out digestion and excretion.